The garage smelled of stale air and decades of accumulated dust. Jake Morrison stood in the center, his boots crunching on grit. Every inch of floor space was claimed by stacks of empty cardboard boxes, leaning towers of paper, and forgotten remnants of a previous life. He grabbed the nearest stack, the cardboard rough and biting against his skin, and shoved it toward the corner. The pile wobbled, then collapsed, sending a cloud of gray particles into the dim light. He did not stop. He braced his shoulder against a heavy crate, feeling the resistance of the concrete floor, and pushed until it scraped aside. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. The space he cleared was barely wide enough for a single desk, yet he moved with the precision of a man carving out an empire. Outside, the muffled sound of neighbors pulling into their driveways drifted through the walls, a reminder of the world moving on without him. Inside, there was only the sound of his own breathing and the sharp slide of cardboard across grit. He wiped his palms on his legs, stepped back, and looked at the small, cleared patch of floor. It was not much, but it was enough to start. Jake hauled a single product onto the desk, the weight of it anchoring his focus. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen flickering to life in the dim garage light. His banking app displayed a number that barely reached 3 digits. It was a thin margin, a sliver of safety that could vanish with one bad decision. He set the phone down, face up, a constant reminder of the deadline he had set for himself. He grabbed a roll of packing tape, the sound of the adhesive ripping away from the spool sharp and loud in the quiet garage. He centered the shipping label on the box, smoothing it down with his palm to remove any air bubbles. He pressed hard, feeling the cardboard give slightly under his fingers. The label was his first real bridge to the outside world. He stood back, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, and took a slow breath. The garage felt different now, less like a storage space, more like an office. He picked up the box, the weight balanced and solid. He walked it to the center of the workspace, placed it exactly where it needed to be, and waited for the next step of the process to begin. The laptop screen cast a steady blue-white glow across the garage, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Jake sat in the chair, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on the sales dashboard. He refreshed the page. The counter remained at 0. He waited, letting the silence of the garage settle around him like a heavy shroud. Outside, the world continued its rhythm, but inside, time felt frozen in a state of unyielding stillness. He watched the cursor blink, a rhythmic, mocking heartbeat on the dark interface. Every hour that passed without a notification felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He stood up, paced the length of the garage, and walked back to the desk, hoping the screen had betrayed him. It had not. The numbers remained stagnant, mocking his anticipation. The silence grew louder, filled with the hum of the cooling fan and the distant, muffled sound of a passing car. His resolve began to fray at the edges, tested by the absence of feedback. He realized then that the market was not indifferent. It was simply unaware. The lack of movement was not just a delay, it was a challenge, a barrier he had to dismantle through sheer persistence. He sat back down, leaned into the light of the monitor, and stared at the empty queue until his vision blurred. The blue light of the screen was no longer a beacon, but a microscope. Jake stopped waiting for the market to come to him, and started hunting for the reasons it had stayed away. He opened a new tab, then another, until his browser groaned under the weight of dozens of competitor profiles. He clicked through pages of customer feedback, reading every grievance, every complaint, and every suggestion buried in the comments sections of similar products. His eyes began to sting, a sharp, dry heat that made him blink rapidly, but he did not look away. He grabbed a notepad and a pen, scratching down recurring themes, missing features, poor durability, confusing instructions. He cross-referenced prices and delivery times, building a mental map of where the current market failed. He ignored the clock on the wall. The garage turned cold as the night deepened, but he stayed locked in the glow of his research. He found a pattern. Customers were begging for a solution that didn't exist in the current listings. He zoomed in on a specific feature gap, his finger tracing the text on the screen. The frustration of the previous week dissolved into a singular, sharp clarity. He had his answer. He saved his notes, pushed the keyboard away, and let his eyes rest for a moment, the strategy finally taking shape in the quiet dark. The delivery truck rumbled to a halt on the gravel driveway outside. Jake heard the heavy thud of boxes hitting the concrete floor of his garage. He signed the clipboard, his pulse quickening with the promise of a fresh start. This was the inventory that would turn his research into revenue. He grabbed a box cutter, the blade sliding through the packing tape with a crisp, satisfying sound. He pulled the flaps back, ready to inspect the quality he had gambled his savings to secure. The smell of crushed cardboard and splintered plastic hit him first. He reached in, pulling out a unit, but the casing crumbled in his grip like dry leaves. He tossed it aside and grabbed another, then a third. Every single piece was pulverized, shattered by the weight of poor stacking during transit. He stood amidst the debris, his breath catching in his throat. He picked up a jagged piece of the main housing, turning it over in his palm. The electrical guts were exposed, mangled beyond any hope of simple repair. The silence of the garage returned, but this time it was heavy with the weight of lost capital and broken momentum. He stared at the mountain of ruined product, the reality of the setback sinking in, threatening to erase everything he had worked to build. Jake did not call the supplier. He did not ask for a refund. He cleared the workbench, shoved the debris aside, and pulled a roll of industrial-strength tape and a tube of adhesive from his toolbox. The first night was a blur of precision. He stripped away the shredded original packaging, cleaning each component with a damp cloth until his fingertips were raw. He spent hours realigning shattered plastic casings, holding them in place until the glue set, his muscles locking in the cold garage air. By the second night, he had developed a rhythm. He braced the internal frames with cardboard scraps he scrounged from the floor. His hands cramped, but he didn't stop. He worked until the sun bled through the garage windows, then started again when the light faded. The third night was the hardest. The coffee ran out, and the exhaustion began to pull at his eyelids. But he kept moving. He tested every switch, every connection, and every seal. He sanded down rough edges until the units looked finished, if not perfect. When he finally placed the last repaired item into a clean box, his back was stiff and his hands were stained with adhesive, but the inventory was ready. He had turned a pile of scrap back into a business. Friday night arrived with the sound of engines idling in the street. Through the small, dust-streaked window of the garage, Jake watched his neighbors walk toward their cars, laughing as they headed out for the weekend. The muffled bass of music drifted through the neighborhood, a rhythmic reminder of the life he was currently shelving. A sharp knock rattled the side door. It was Mark, holding a set of keys and gesturing toward the main road. "Come on, Jake. One drink won't kill the business." Jake looked at the stack of customer emails waiting on his screen. He looked at the dim, fluorescent light hanging over his workbench. He shook his head, offering a thin, tired smile. "Not tonight, Mark. I have too much to finish." The door clicked shut, the lock sliding home with a heavy, final sound. He turned back to the glowing monitor. The cursor blinked in the silence. He began typing, addressing the first of 50 inquiries. Every keystroke was a trade-off. He ignored the fatigue pulling at his shoulders and the stillness of the room. He was not just answering emails. He was building a wall between his old life and the one he was determined to forge in this concrete box. The final email was sent at 3 in the morning. Jake sat back, his chair creaking in the stillness, and let his hands drop to his sides. His eyes felt dry, stinging from the glow of the monitor. He reached for his water bottle, but stopped mid-motion. A sharp, clear chime cut through the silence of the garage. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. A new order notification blinked in the corner. He refreshed the page, his heart hammering against his ribs. The transaction was complete. A notification from the bank portal confirmed the deposit. $12. It was a meager sum, barely covering the cost of the packaging tape, but it was the first real proof that the system worked. He stared at the number, tracing the digits on the glass screen with his index finger. The fatigue that had been dragging at his limbs vanished, replaced by a sudden electric clarity. He was no longer just guessing. He was trading. He stood up, paced the length of the concrete floor, and looked at his workspace with new eyes. The garage was cold. The air smelled of cardboard and dust, but for the first time, it felt like a foundation. He sat back down and opened the sales report again, watching that $12 figure as if it were a map to everything that would follow. The $12 sat in his account, a small but undeniable weight. Jake opened his bank portal, his cursor hovering over the option to transfer the funds to his personal wallet. It would have paid for a decent meal or a few hours of heat for the garage. He stared at the screen, the numbers blinking back at him. He closed the transfer window. Instead, he navigated to his supplier list, clicking through the costs of bulk shipping. If he bought 2 units now, he could sell 4 later. If he sold 4, he could double that again. He calculated the margin on his desk, his pencil scratching rapidly against a scrap of packing paper. He was not buying luxury, he was buying momentum. He executed the order, watching the balance return to 0 as the funds moved toward the warehouse supplier. The garage felt smaller now, crowded by the phantom inventory he had just secured. He stood up and cleared a wider space on his workbench, moving his tools into a single, neat line. This was the new baseline. Every cent he earned was a brick in a wall he was building 1 layer at a time. He checked the delivery date for the new shipment, then sat back down to start the cycle over. The feedback emails piled up, a digital mountain of identical frustrations. Jake stopped reading them as individual sales and started scanning them for the pattern. 3 times in 1 hour, he saw the same complaint. The tools he sold lacked a simple, essential adjustment. He clicked through his competitor pages, comparing their features to the list of grievances. They were all chasing the same generic trends, ignoring the obvious gap in utility. He tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythm mirroring the rapid-fire thoughts in his head. If he kept selling what everyone else sold, he would stay trapped in the same cycle of thin margins and dead ends. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his stack and drew a single, heavy line through his current product list. The decision felt final. He closed the browser tabs for the trending items, the screen suddenly stark and empty. He did not need another shipment of mass-produced junk. He needed a solution that actually did what the customers were begging for. He reached for his notebook, sketching the design of a custom tool that solved the problem he had just identified. The air in the garage shifted. The stakes were no longer about volume, but about precision. He was done playing the market. Now, he was going to dictate it. Jake spent the next 48 hours scouring industrial directories. He filtered through dozens of overseas plants, rejecting those that demanded minimums he could not afford. Finally, he found one that accepted small-batch custom work. He drafted the proposal, attaching his crude sketches and the specific engineering requirements he had mapped out. The send button felt like a heavy stone. With 1 click, he emptied his business account to cover the initial tooling fee. His screen displayed a confirmation of the transfer, leaving his balance at 0. He did not leave his desk. He stared at the inbox, the cursor blinking in the center of the white space. Minutes stretched into hours. He stood up, paced the length of the garage, and sat back down. His pulse hammered against his ribs. Every second of silence from the manufacturer was a possibility of failure. If they rejected the design, his capital was gone, and he had no inventory to sell. He checked his phone, checked the server, and checked the bank again. Still nothing. He gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. The gamble was in motion. There was no way to recall the funds, and no way to retreat. He leaned back, listening to the hum of the cooling fan, waiting for the ping that would either validate his path or break his business. Days bled into nights. The silence from the factory grew heavier with every passing hour. Jake stopped checking the bank account and started watching the calendar. When the notification finally chimed, it was not the confirmation he wanted. The manufacturer reported a casting error, pushing the completion date back by a week. Jake stared at the screen, the words blurring. A week felt like a lifetime, with 0 inventory and mounting overhead. He stood up and pushed a heavy stack of cardboard boxes aside, clearing space he did not have, just to feel like he was doing something. He paced the concrete floor until his boots ached. The pressure was no longer just financial. It was the weight of his own conviction. If this failed, there was no backup plan, no capital left to pivot. He spent the next 3 days refining the product listings, rewriting every line of copy until the value proposition was undeniable. He was betting everything on a single, unproven custom tool. Outside, the neighborhood moved on with their lives, but inside the garage, time had stalled. He sat in the dark, the glow of the monitor casting long, sharp shadows across the room. He was waiting for the final word, poised on the edge of a total collapse or a total victory. The final notification pinged at dawn. The product was live. Jake watched the screen, his finger hovering over the refresh key. The first hour brought silence. Then, a single chime echoed through the garage. A sale. He refreshed the page. 3 more orders appeared. He blinked, unsure if the connection had glitched. Then came 5. then 10. The notification sound changed from a sporadic alert into a constant, rhythmic pulse. Jake scrambled to his feet, grabbing his packing tape and a stack of boxes. The desk was no longer a workspace. It was a command center. Orders poured in faster than he could click process. His monitor turned into a blur of green bars and rising numbers. The sales graph, once a flat, desolate line, began a violent, vertical climb. Dozens became hundreds. He didn't stop to eat or drink. He sprinted between the printer and the workbench, his hands moving in a blur of motion. Every time he cleared a notification, 3 more took its place. The garage, once a place of stagnant waiting, was now a whirlwind of activity. He laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. As the screen showed the inventory count plummeting toward 0, he was no longer just managing a store. He was struggling to keep pace with a tidal wave of demand. The garage had become a labyrinth of cardboard and tape. Every square inch of concrete floor was buried under towers of inventory. Jake could no longer walk a straight line from the desk to the main door. He had to sidestep, ducking under low-hanging stacks that threatened to topple with a single nudge. The smell of fresh adhesive and corrugated paper filled the air, thick and heavy. He reached for a shipping label, but his hand hit a crate, sending a tower of boxes swaying dangerously. He caught it just in time, his heart hammering against his ribs. The workbench was gone, buried beneath a mountain of unboxed supplies, forcing him to pack shipments on the floor in a cramped, dark corner. He turned to grab a roll of tape, but his foot caught on a stray corner of a box, and he stumbled hard into the wall. There was no room left to breathe, let alone work. He stood in the center of the chaos, his elbows brushing against stacks of product on both sides. He looked at the door, then back at the suffocating walls. The garage had served its purpose, but it was now a cage. He had reached the absolute limit of what these 4 walls could contain. The lease for the storage unit was a single sheet of paper, but it felt like a lifeline. Jake spent the entire morning hauling boxes from the garage to the new space, his muscles aching with every trip. The garage floor was finally visible again, but the volume of orders remained relentless. He stared at his packing list, realizing he was losing hours to simple manual labor. That afternoon, he posted a handwritten sign for help. A young person arrived, eager and quick-handed. Jake handed over the tape gun, watching as his new assistant mirrored his process with surprising speed. For the first time in months, Jake stepped away from the workbench. He moved to his desk to focus on inventory management and sourcing. The rhythm of the work changed instantly. With an extra set of hands, the backlog vanished. The storage unit filled up, but the garage remained clear and functional. Jake watched his assistant seal a box and print a label, then turned his attention to the growth charts on his screen. The solo act was over. He was no longer just a man with a desk. He was the center of a functioning operation. He took a deep breath, looked at the empty space on the floor, and began planning for the next scale-up. The floor-to-ceiling glass wall offered a view that felt impossible from the perspective of a garage. Jake stood with his hands locked behind his back, looking down at the massive distribution center below. Hundreds of workers moved with precision across the concrete floor, guided by automated conveyors that snaked through the facility like steel veins. The hum of the operation was constant, a low vibration that traveled through the glass and into his palms. He watched a forklift navigate a narrow aisle, its load perfectly stacked, mirroring the patterns he had once managed with his own hands. Every square foot of this space represented a problem solved, a supply chain optimized, and a decision made under pressure. He traced the lines of the loading docks, where trucks arrived and departed in a rhythmic, endless cycle. The scale was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the days when a single missing package felt like the end of the business. He turned away from the view, his silhouette sharp against the light flooding into the office. He checked his watch, the silence of the room punctuated only by the distant, muffled sound of the facility at work. He was ready for the next person to walk through his door. A knock echoed against the glass door. A young man entered, his eyes scanning the expansive office with a mixture of awe and calculation. He stopped in the center of the room, looking toward the windows before turning his attention back to Jake. "They say you built this from nothing," the visitor said, gesturing to the floor-to-ceiling displays of logistics reports. "I have the capital and the plan, but I cannot find the spark. What is the secret?" Jake did not point to his computer. the charts, or the panoramic view of the distribution center. Instead, he walked toward a darkened corner of the office. There, standing against the pristine white wall, sat an old, paint-chipped shelf. It was scarred, uneven, and clearly out of place. Jake stopped in front of it. He ran his fingers along the rough, splintered edge of the wood, feeling the dried varnish and the dents left by years of heavy boxes. The visitor approached, squinting at the relic. Jake looked back at him, his expression unreadable, and rested his palm flat against the wood. The silence in the room sharpened as the contrast between the multi-million-dollar empire and the discarded piece of garage furniture became impossible to ignore. Jake pressed his palm harder against the grain. The wood was cold, still bearing the faint indentations of the first boxes he had ever shipped. He turned his head to look directly at the visitor. "I did not wait for a loan," he said. "I did not wait for a perfect market or a team of consultants." He traced a deep scratch on the shelf's surface with his thumb. "I started with this shelf and a single box. That was the extent of my infrastructure." The visitor leaned in, watching Jake's hand move across the scarred surface. Jake did not look at the glass walls or the bustling center below. He kept his eyes on the wood. "Everything you see outside the conveyors, the trucks, the shipping volume, it all exists because I stopped looking for the ideal conditions. I stopped waiting for the environment to change and simply moved the inventory I had." He knocked his knuckles against the shelf. It sounded hollow and solid at once. "The secret is not in the scaling, but in the first step. I chose to use what was directly in front of me." The visitor stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the chipped paint, the weight of the statement settling into the silence of the room. The visitor lingered for a second, then nodded and walked toward the exit. Jake watched the heavy glass door swing shut, the soft click of the latch echoing in the quiet office. He returned to his desk. Sliding into the leather chair that had replaced his old wooden stool, he opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his face in the darkening room. A password entry, a quick series of clicks, and the financial report loaded. He scrolled past the logistical overhead, the quarterly shipping costs, and the regional tax breakdowns. His eyes stopped at the very last line of the document. The total net worth figure was displayed in bold, black text. 7 digits, officially crossing the $1 million mark. He did not call anyone. He did not stand up to celebrate. He simply rested his hands on the edge of the desk, the cool metal surface grounding him. He watched the cursor blink at the end of the line, a rhythmic, steady pulse in the dim light. He took a long, slow breath, listening to the hum of the ventilation system. The math was final, the work was verified. He tapped the trackpad to close the report, the screen fading to black. The office was silent, save for the faint sound of his own breathing, steady and deliberate. Jake pushed his chair back, the wheels rolling silently over the carpet. He reached across the desk and picked up his keys, the metal teeth clinking against the mahogany wood. He stood, his joints popping, and walked toward the heavy glass door. He paused at the threshold, looking out across the distribution center. The conveyor belts had stopped for the night, leaving the massive space in a state of stillness. He reached for the light switch, flicking it down, and the office plunged into darkness. He stepped into the corridor, the motion sensor lights flickering to life as he walked. His footsteps were rhythmic and steady against the polished concrete floor. He reached the main exit, pushed the heavy bar, and stepped out into the cool air of the parking lot. The city lights glowed in the distance, but he did not look toward them. He walked to his vehicle, unlocked the door, and got in. The engine turned over with a sharp, immediate roar. He shifted into drive and pulled away, the red glow of his taillights fading into the night. The garage was empty, the office was dark. But the empire remained, built not by luck, but by the slow, deliberate work of a single person.